Weird scenes inside the canyon. Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops and The Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. David McGowan. Head Press. 3. Table of Contents. Forward by Nick Bryant. 1 Preface. 7 1 Village of the Damned. By way of an introduction. 11 2 Power to the people. Call this a counterculture. 22 3 Dig. The Laurel Canyon Death List. 34 Related Lives and Relative Deaths. 41 5 Desirable People. The Canyon's Peculiar Past. 56 Vito and His Freakus. The Sinister Roots of Hippie Culture. 62 7 The Death of Godo Polikas. Anger's Infant Lucifer. 73 8 All the Young Turks. Hollywood Tripping. 85 9 Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. 96 10 Helter Skelter in a Summer Swelter. Return of the Death List. 106 11 Day Tours, Rustic Canyon and Greyston Park. 1 2012 Riders on the Storm. The Doors. 128 13 8 Miles High and Falling Fast. The Birds. 136 14 The Great Serendipity. Buffalo Springfield. 147 15 Beyond Buffalo Springfield and the Monkeys. 2 159 16 Altamorn Pie. Graham Parsons. 169 17 The Lost Expedition of Gene Clark. 187 18 The Wolf King of L.A. Papa John Phillips. 219 Hungry Freaks. Daddy Frank Zappa. 216 20 Born to be Wild. John K. 227 21 A Whiter Shade of Pale. Arthur Lee and Love. 236 22 Endless Vibrations. The Beach Boys. 249 23 The Grim Game. Houdini. 263 24 Won't Get Fooled Again. Punk and New Wave Arrive. 277 Epilogue. 284 Acknowledgements. 301 Selected Bibliography and Filmography. 302 Index. 306 About the Author. 315 IV 1 Forward by Nick Bryant. Oscar Wilde said of art, "Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril." And author David McGowan has found that Wilde's quote is quite prophetic for the rock and roll scene that thrived in Laurel Canyon in the 1960s and 1970s. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon is McGowan taking a hammer to the icons and mythologies of 1960s counterculture, reducing them to dust, swept away by gusts of pomp, pretense, and even deceit. McGowan, though, isn't wielding his hammer with the zeal of an establishment conformist or neocon, but rather in the same forlorn spirit as Nietzsche declaring that God is dead. As a homegrown product of Los Angeles with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Southern California rock scene, McGowan appears to be entirely declaring that the gods of his youth are dead. Laurel Canyon was the fountainhead for the peace, love, and brown rice vibes that overflowed America's airwaves as the Vietnam War raged. But lurking beneath its tie-dyed and florid veneer was an exquisite dark ness of drugs, unbridled debauchery, full-tilt depravity, and shocking carnage. When readers of this book are delivered to Laurel Canyon's blood-drenched tapestry of murder and mayhem, they will have to decide whether or not those sinister synchronicities are uncanny coincidences, conspiracies, or perhaps a kaleidoscopic blending of both. Sprinkled throughout these pages is the ominous specter of the military intelligence complex, and perched quite literally atop Laurel Canyon was the top-secret Lookout Mountain Laboratory, which seems to be McGowan's grand metaphor for Dr. Strangelove having a bird's-eye view of the nascent hippie movement, treating it as though it were a WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON. 2. Petri dish brimming with a lethal biological weapon that could be unleashed in meticulously monitored increments. Indeed, many of Laurel Canyon's rock and roll idols had former incarnations steeped in the world of military intelligence operations. Jim Morrison, aka the Lizard King, was one such example. Mr. Mojo Risen didn't much like to talk about his parents, and was even known to tell reporters that his parents were dead. But as it turns out, Lizard King, Sr. was not only alive and well, he just happened to be the commander of the U.S. warships that allegedly came under attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, sparking America's napalm-fueled bloodbath in Vietnam. Frank Zappa, another major mover and shaker of the Laurel Canyon scene, was certainly the raddest of the rad, so surely he couldn't have had any connections to the military intelligence complex, right? Not exactly. According to various accounts collected by McGowan, Zappa was a pro-military autocrat who didn't really resonate with the Cone culture's peace and love vibe. Like the Lizard King's dad, Zappa, Sr. was a cog in the intelligence community's dark machinations. Francis Zappa was a chemical warfare specialist with a top security clearance at Edgewood Arsenal near Baltimore, Maryland. Some readers might recognize Edgewood as the location of ominous mind control experiments conducted by the CIA under the rubric of MKUltra. Guilt by familial association has the potential to be an ill-fated formula for speculation, but McGowan relates accounts of Laurel Canyon luminaries whose own hands were possibly awash in the blood of the military intelligence complex. Consider, for example, Papa John Phillips, who penned the smash hit San Francisco, "Be sure to wear flowers in your hair," imploring thousands of runaways to make bacchanal-laced pilgrimages to the city by the bay. The son of a Marine Corps captain, Phillips was among the more prominent fixtures of Laurel Canyon, who had a particularly interesting interrelationship with the melee Terry machine. Rock superstar Stephen Stills was the co-founder of two Laurel Canyon dynamos, Buffalo Springfield, and, of course, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Surely then hippie icon Stills couldn't possibly be enmeshed in the military intelligence complex. Maybe, maybe not. The progeny of yet another military family, Stills spent chunks of his childhood in El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Panama, where the U.S. has a history of spread. Forward. 3. In a genocidal form of democracy. And McGowan has sifted through accounts of Stills actually confessing to running around the jungles of Vietnam in the early 1960s, anecdotes generally dismissed, as the author notes, as drug-fueled delusions. Tales of drugs, unbridled debauchery, and full-tilt depravity are often populated by ethical eunuchs, whose elite deviance yields to particularly malignant appetites. And the people calling Laurel Canyon home were no exception. McGowan introduces us to aging beatnik Vito Polikas and his Freaks, a dance troupe of Dionysian goddesses, who accompanied Vito to the LA nightclubs where the fledgling Laurel Canyon bands were playing their early gigs. In addition to saturating the dance floors with sultry young nubiles for emerging bands, Vito was also a purveyor of teenage girls for the up-and-coming rockers. McGowan also comments on Vito's swift exodus to Haiti, for reasons explained herein. Vito Polikas certainly isn't a household name, but he was far from being a fringe player on the Laurel Canyon scene, where he and his freaks mingled freely with rock and roll's burgeoning royalty. McGowan collects anecdotes suggesting that Vito may have played a key role in the formation and early success of the Byrds, though his name is conspicuously absent from the autobiographical tome of Byrds co-founder David Crosby. We also find Vito in a string of low-budget films, and in a cameo appearance on one of rock's first concept albums, Zappa's Freakout. Vito's parental skills, however, left a lot to be desired, as evinced by the very mysterious and bizarre death of his young son, Godo. Further excavating the idolatry of his youth, McGowan encounters Laurel Canyon fixture Billy Briers, a male madam and gay porn entrepreneur. Briers was investigated for trafficking child pornography in the 1970s, whereupon his stable of male hustlers began coughing up the names of frequent flyers at his bordello, the most notable among them being super freak G-Man J, Edgar Hoover and partner Clyde Tolson. The 1960s was a revolutionary epoch not only in music, but also in Hollywood, and McGowan discusses the symbiosis between the Laurel Canyon music scene and Hollywood's Young Turks, with the box office phenomenon Easy Rider providing a salient nexus between Laurel Canyon rockers and Hollywood upstarts. Many of those upstarts, including Warren Beatty, Peter and Jane Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Candice Bergen, Marlon Brando, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, Peter Lawford, Den WEIRDSCENESIDETHECANYON. 4. NIS Hopper, Ryan O'Neill, MIA Farrow, Peter Sellers, and Jar Jar Gabba were among Papa John and Mama Michelle Phillips' circle of friends. Also making the rounds in Laurel Canyon was America's favorite psychopath, Charles Manson. And Charlie and his family weren't just a peripheral flock of crazed killers among the Laurel Canyon sovereigns. To the contrary, the family mingled with many of the canyon's rock stars. Manson even laid down tracks in Brian Wilson's home studio, stunning the likes of Neil Young. "He had this kind of music that nobody else was doing," said Neil of Charlie. "I thought he really had something crazy, something great. He was like a living poet." Charlie also impressed Terry Melcher, the Byrds' first producer, and a major force in sculpting the Laurel Canyon music scene. Melcher also recorded Manson, finding him to be a much more amicable character than David Crosby. Manson's homicidal Lieutenant Bobby Beausoleil also had some impressive moves as a guitarist and an occultist. Beausoleil played in a number of forgotten bands that had an occult topspin, one of which even opened for Buffalo Springfield. Bobby eventually landed a gig as a rhythm guitarist for the Grassroots, which later transmuted into the Laurel Canyon band Love. McGowan also touches on the grisly Four on the Floor, or Wonderland murders, which left notorious drug dealer Ron Launius and 3 of his gang bludgeoned to death on the floor of a house on Laurel Canyon's Wonderland Avenue. Launius dealt drugs to Laurel Canyon's aristocracy, as well as to porn star John Holmes, then in the twilight of his career. Holmes also befriended LA crime boss club owner Eddie Nash, who he then betrayed, with fatal consequences. Truth be told, the Manson and Wonderland murders were merely spatters on Laurel Canyon's blood-drenched tapestry. In the pages of this fascinating book, McGowan chronicles tale after tale of suicide and murder, while delivering readers to a web of sinister synchronicities. Ultimately, it is up to the reader to decide whether Laurel Canyon, in its heyday, was the counterculture haven portrayed by other chroniclers of the era, or whether it was the epicenter of intrigues whose ripple effects are like the aftershock of a nuclear bomb. Nick Bryant, July 29, 2013. I think these days, especially in the States, you have to be a politician, or an assassin, or something to really be a superstar. Jim Morrison. Before he was the Lizard King, U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison and his son, James Douglas Morrison, on the bridge of the USS Bonhomme Richard, January 1964. This book is dedicated to all those whose blood still stains the canyon floor. 7. Preface. It began innocently enough. In my normal, everyday life I spend a fair amount of time researching corruption and criminality in the realms of politics and law enforcement. Much of that research has taken me down some very dark and twisted paths. But this was going to be different. I was, after all, going to be vacationing in a lush, tropical paradise, and I really just wanted to turn my brain off for a couple weeks and forget about all of that. Not long before this much-anticipated break from reality, my eldest daughter had given me a copy of Michael Walker's Laurel Canyon, the inside story of rock and roll's legendary neighborhood, which chronicles the Los Angeles music scene of the late 1960s through the 1970s. It seemed like the ideal escapist entertainment that would undoubtedly conjure up many fond memories of the music that provided the soundtrack to my formative years. What could be further removed from my usual reading material? As is often the case though, things didn't work out exactly as planned. Alarm bells started going off in my head soon after arriving at my destination and diving into the book. What was this about secret underground tunnels connecting some of the iconic Laurel Canyon properties? And what about all those mysterious fires that wiped away the homes of a number of prominent singers and musicians? And why were there so many violent deaths, so closely associated with a scene that was supposed to be all about peace and love? And what of Walker's throwaway mention of a secret fortified military installation sitting right smack dab in the middle of Hippodom? And why did at least a few of America's new minstrels seem to come from career military families and from the world of covert intelligence operations? And how exactly do the casual allusions to pedophilia fit into this increasingly curious scene? WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 8. While Walker had done a decent job of telling the Laurel Canyon story from a mainstream perspective, there seemed to be a much more intriguing story hidden in the details that he tended to cast aside as interesting, but largely meaningless incongruities. Before I was even halfway through my sorely needed rest and relaxation time, I was champing at the bit to get back home and dig deeper into this story. And immediately upon my return, I began devouring everything I could find that had been written on the subject. Although I am regarded by many people as a conspiracy theorist, which is more often than not utilized as a pejorative term, I do all of my research through very mainstream channels. I am a big believer in the notion that the truth is out there, but don't expect it to be delivered to you in a tidy package by any mainstream media outlets. Finding it involves assembling a jigsaw puzzle of sorts, with the goal being to gather up all the bits and pieces of information that other writers tend to present as throwaway facts and or interesting anomalies. Sometimes those bits and pieces end up being no more than interesting anomalies, but past experience has taught me that if those divergent facts are properly assembled, a new picture often begins to emerge that is strikingly at odds with what is widely accepted as our consensus reality. At the end of the day, it is really all about pattern recognition. If, for example, just a few prominent Laurel Canyon musicians happen to come from military intelligence families, then we could probably safely write that off as an interesting, but largely inconsequential aberration. But if an uncanny number of the leading lights of the Laurel Canyon scene grew up in such an environment, then that is clearly a meaningful pattern. And if a few of the new breed of stars happen to have violent death intrude upon their personal lives, then that would be a tragic, but largely inconsequential fact. But when it becomes clear that violent death surrounded the entire scene, with whole families at times dying off under suspicious circumstances, then that again is a distinguishing pattern, and one that has been all but ignored by other chroniclers of the scene. There is little doubt in my mind that this book will not be warmly received by all readers. In our celebrity-driven culture, calling into question the character and motivations of so many widely admired and respected figures from the entertainment community is never a good Preface. 9. Way to win popularity contests. And when those revered figures are overwhelmingly viewed as icons of various leftist causes, it is definitely not the way to win fans among those who consider themselves to be liberals, progressives or leftists. But while my sympathies lie solidly in the leftward flanks of the political spectrum, there are no sacred cows in either this book or in any of my past work. I really have no agenda other than to seek out unspoken truths and better my own understanding of the world we live in. I have no political party affiliations and have never been associated in any way with any governmental or quasi-governmental entities. And for the record, I was not born into the world of military intelligence operations. My rather uneventful childhood was spent in a quiet slice of suburbia with 2 public school teachers as parents. I have never claimed to be in possess scion of any inside information, or to have access to any highly placed confidential sources. My research and the views expressed in my work are very much my own. While almost all of my past and present literary contributions are generally regarded as being quite controversial, the individual facts contained in this volume are not really controversial at all. All of them, as previously noted, have been mined from very respectable mainstream sources. It is only the way that I have presented those facts, in other words, the way that I have chosen to assemble the puzzle, that makes them controversial. There will undoubtedly be those who will stridently claim that I have carefully cherry-picked my facts to paint an unnecessarily dark portrait of many of the iconic figures who make up the cast of this story. Anyone, so the argument goes, could be made to look bad through such a journalistic approach. I would strongly disagree with that assessment, however. Such criticisms, in my opinion, completely miss the point of the book, which is that when stripped of the usual spin that accompanies them, and when assembled so that they become part of overriding patterns, these anomalous facts reveal truths that would not otherwise be visible. Another criticism I anticipate is that I did not go out and attempt to speak directly to the people who made up the scene. True enough, but the primary reason for that is that there is very little chance that the aging rock stars and their handlers would have wanted anything to WERDSCENSIDETHECANYON 10 do with me. Other chroniclers of the era have gained access to those involved, but that access has come, also it appears to me, with a steep price in journalistic integrity. The inevitable result is what amounts to puff pieces with a mind-numbing sameness, with the same tired anecdotal stories uncritically told over and over again in the very same way, even when those stories can't possibly be true. I have no desire to serve as a publicist for the estates of Jim Morrison, John Phillips, or Frank Zappa, nor do I have any interest in filling the pages of this book with the same apocryphal tales told by other scribes. There are any number of literary offerings listed in the bibliography that will provide that type of a reading experience. My goal here is to break new ground and open readers' minds to the possibility that other writers may have left out some of the most important elements of this underreported tale. The story of the scene that played out in Laurel Canyon from the mid-1960s through the end of the 1970s is an endlessly fascinating one. It wasn't until fairly recently that the mainstream version of the tale was belatedly told, and even now it remains a story unknown by most of those who were not a part of it. Virtually everyone has heard of the Haight-Ashbury scene up north in San Francisco, but even most native Angelenos remain ignorant of the even larger music and counterculture scene that played out in the Hollywood Hills. It seems a bit odd that, nearly a full half-century after the fact, the Haight is almost universally regarded as the birthplace of hippies and flower children, despite the fact that the Laurel Canyon scene preceded and largely inspired what became a parallel scene up north. Why is it that the Haight has been thrust into the spotlight for so long while so little attention has been paid to the scene that spawned it? Perhaps the Laurel Canyon scene was hiding so many dark secrets that it was better to just let it lie undisturbed. And perhaps it is now time to shine a light into some of the darker corners of the canyon to see what kind of skeletons might be hiding there. 1 Village of the Damned. By way of an introduction. There's something happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear. Join me now, if you have the time, as we take a stroll down memory lane to a time nearly 5 decades ago. A time when America last had uniformed ground troops fighting a sustained and bloody battle to impose some decidedly Orwellian democracy on a sovereign nation. It is the first week of August, 1964, and U.S. warships under the command of U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison have allegedly come under attack while patrolling Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf. This event, subsequently dubbed the Tonkin Gulf Incident, will result in the immediate passing by the U.S. Congress of the obviously pre-drafted Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which will, in turn, quickly lead to America's deep immersion into the bloody Vietnam quagmire. Before it is over, well over 50,000 American bodies, along with literally millions of Southeast Asian bodies, will litter the battlefields of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. For the record, the Tonkin Gulf Incident appears to differ somewhat from other alleged provocations that have driven this country to war. This was not, as we have seen so many times before, a false flag operation, which is to say, an operation that involves Uncle Sam attacking himself and then pointing an accusatory finger at someone else. It was also not, as we have also seen on more than one occasion, an WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 1-2 attack that was quite deliberately provoked. No, what the Tonkin Gulf incident actually was, as it turns out, is an attack that never took place at all. The entire incident, as has been all but officially acknowledged, was spun from whole cloth. It is quite possible, however, that the intent was to provoke a defensive response, which could have then been cast as an unprovoked attack on U.S. ships. The ships in question were on an intelligence mission, and were operating in a decidedly provocative manner. It is quite possible that when Vietnamese forces failed to respond as anticipated, Uncle Sam decided to just pretend as though they had. Nevertheless, by early February 1965, the U.S. will, without a declaration of war, and with no valid reason to wage one, begin indiscriminately bombing North Vietnam. By March of that same year, the infamous Operation Rolling Thunder will commence. Over the course of the next 3.5 years, millions of tons of bombs, missiles, rockets, incendiary devices and chemical warfare agents will be dumped on the people of Vietnam in what can only be described as one of the worst crimes against humanity ever perpetrated on this planet. Also in March of 1965, the first uniformed U.S. soldier officially sets foot on Vietnamese soil, although Special Forces units masquerading as advisors and trainers have been there for at least 4 years, and likely much longer. By April 1965, fully 25,000 uniformed American kids, most still teenagers barely out of high school, are slogging through the rice paddies of Vietnam. By the end of the year, U.S. troop strength will have surged to 200,000. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world in those early months of 1965, a new scene is just beginning to take shape in the city of Los Angeles. In a geographically and socially isolated community known as Laurel Canyon, a heavily wooded, rustic, serene, yet vaguely ominous slice of LA nestled in the hills that separate the Los Angeles basin from the San Fernando Valley, musicians, singers and songwriters suddenly begin to gather, as though summoned there by some unseen Pied Piper. Within months, the hippie flower child movement is begotten there, along with the new style of music that will provide the soundtrack for the tumultuous second half of the 1960s. Beginning in the mid-1960s and carrying through the decade of the 1970s, an uncanny number of rock music superstars will emerge from David M. C. Gowan. 1-3 Laurel Canyon. The first to drop an album is The Byrds, whose biggest star will prove to be David Crosby. The band's debut effort, Mr. Tambourine Man, is released on the summer solstice of 1965. It will quickly be followed by releases from the John Phillips-led Mamas and the Papas, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, January 1966, Love with Arthur Lee, Love, May 1966, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention of Freak Out, June 1966, Buffalo Springfield, featuring Stephen Stills and Neil Young, Buffalo Springfield, October 1966, and The Doors, January 1967. One of the earliest on the Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene is Jim Morrison, the enigmatic lead singer of The Doors. Jim will quickly become one of the most iconic, controversial, critically acclaimed, and influential figures to take up residence in Laurel Canyon. Curiously enough though, the self-proclaimed Lizard King has another claim to fame as well, albeit one that none of his numerous chroniclers will feel is of much relevance to his career and possible untimely death. He is the son, as it happens, of the aforementioned Admiral George Stephen Morrison. And so it is that, even while the father is actively conspiring to fabricate an incident that will be used to massively accelerate an illegal war, the son is positioning himself to become an icon of the hippie anti-war crowd. Nothing unusual about that, I suppose. It is, you know, a small world and all. And it is not as if Jim Morrison's story is in any way unique. During the early years of its heyday, Laurel Canyon's father figure is the rather eccentric personality known as Frank Zappa. Though he and his various mothers of invention lineups will never attain the commercial success of the band headed by the Admiral's son, Frank will be a hugely influential figure among his contemporaries. Ensconced in an abode dubbed the Log Cabin, which sat right in the heart of Laurel Canyon, at the crossroads of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain Avenue, Zappa will play host to virtually every musician who passes through the canyon in the mid to late 1960s. He will also discover and sign numerous acts to his various Laurel Canyon-based record labels. Many of these acts will be rather bizarre and somewhat obscure characters, think Captain Beefheart and Larry Wildman Fischere, but some of them, such as psychedelic rocker cum shock rocker WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 1-4. Alice Cooper will go on to superstardom. Zappa, along with certain members of his sizable entourage, the Log Cabin was run as an early commune, with numerous hangers-on occupying various rooms in the main house and the guest house, as well as the peculiar caves and tunnels lacing the grounds of the home. Far from the quaint homestead the name seems to imply, the Log Cabin was a cavernous 5-level home that featured a 2,000+ square foot living room, with 3 massive chandeliers, and an enormous floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. Will also be instrumental in introducing the look and attitude that will define the hippie counterculture, although the Zappa crew prefers the label freak. Nevertheless, Zappa will never make a secret of the fact that he has nothing but contempt for the hippie culture that he will help create, and with which he will surround himself. Given that Zappa is, by various accounts, a pro-military, rigidly authoritarian control freak, it is perhaps unsurprising that he will not feel a kinship with the youth movement that he will help nurture. And it is probably safe to say that Frank's dad also would have had little regard for the youth culture of the 1960s, given that Francis Zappa was, in case you were wondering, a chemical warfare specialist assigned to, where else, the Edgewood Arsenal near Baltimore, Maryland. Edgewood is, of course, the longtime home of America's chemical warfare program, as well as a facility frequently cited as being deeply enmeshed in McUltra operations. Curiously enough, Frank Zappa literally grew up at the Edgewood Arsenal, having lived the first 7 years of his life in military housing on the grounds of the facility. The family later moved to Lancaster, California, near Edwards Air Force Base, where Francis Zappa continued to busy himself doing classified work for the military intelligence complex. His son, meanwhile, prepped himself to become an icon of the peace and love crowd. Again, nothing unusual about that, I suppose. Zappa's manager is a shadowy character by the name of Herb Cohen, who had come out to LA from the Bronx with his brother Mutt just before the music and club scene began heating up. Cohen, a former U.S. Marine, had spent a few years traveling the world before his arrival on the Laurel Canyon scene. Those travels, curiously, had taken him to the Congo in 1961, at the very time that leftist Prime Minister Patrice David M. C. Gowan 1-5 Lumumba was being tortured and killed by our very own CIA. Not to worry though, according to one of Zappa's biographers, Cohen wasn't in the Congo on some kind of nefarious intelligence mission. No, he was there, on the contrary, to supply arms to Lumumba in defiance of the CIA. Because, you know, that is the kind of thing that globe-trotting ex-Marines did in those days, as we'll see soon enough when we take a look at another Laurel Canyon luminary. Making up the other half of Laurel Canyon's first family is Frank's wife, Gail Zappa, known formally as Adelaide Sloatman. Gail hails from a long line of career naval officers, including her father, who spent his life working on classified nuclear weapons research for the U.S. Navy. Gale herself once worked as a secretary for the Office of Naval Research and Development. She also once told an interviewer that she had heard voices all her life, many years before their nearly simultaneous OU's arrival in Laurel Canyon. Gale had attended a naval kindergarten class with Mr. Mojo Risen himself, Jim Morrison. It is claimed that, as children, Gale once hit Jim over the head with a hammer. The very same Jim Morrison had later attended the same Alexandria, Virginia, high school as two other future Laurel Canyon luminaries, John Phillips and Cass Elliot. Papa John Phillips, more so than probably any of the other illustrious OU's residents of Laurel Canyon, will play a major role in spreading the emerging youth counterculture across America. His contribution will be twofold. First, he will co-organize the famed Monterey Pop Festival, which, through unprecedented media exposure, will give mainstream America its first real look at the music and fashions of the nascent hippie movement. Second, Phillips will pen an insipid song known as San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, which will quickly rise to the top of the charts. Along with the Monterey Pop Festival, the song will be instrumental in luring the disenfranchised, a preponderance of whom will be underage runaways, to San Francisco, to create the Haight-Ashbury phenomenon and the famed 1967 Summer of Love. Before arriving in Laurel Canyon and opening the doors of his home to the soon-to-be famous, the already famous, and the infamous, such as Charlie Manson, whose family also spent time at the log cabin and at the Laurel Canyon home of Mama Cass Elliot, which, in case you didn't know, sat right across the road from the Laurel Canyon home. WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON 1-6 of Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. John Edmund Andrew Phillips was, shockingly enough, yet another child of the military intelligence complex. The son of U.S. Marine Corps Captain Claude Andrew Phillips and a mother who claimed to have psychic and telekinetic powers, John attended a series of elite military prep schools in the Washington, D.C. area, culminating in an AP appointment to the prestigious U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. After leaving Annapolis, John married Susie Adams, a direct descendant of founding father John Adams. Susie's father, James Adams, Jr., had been involved in what Susie described as cloak and dagger stuff with the Air Force in Vienna, or what others like to call covert intelligence operations. Susie herself would later find employment at the Pentagon, alongside John Phillips' older sister, Rosie, who dutifully reported to work at the complex for nearly 30 years. John's mother, Dean Phillips, also worked for most of her life for the federal government, in some unspecified capacity. And John's older brother, Tommy, was a battle-scarred former U.S. Marine who found work on the Alexandria Police Force as a cop, albeit one with a disciplinary record for exhibiting a violent streak when dealing with people of color. John Phillips, of course, though surrounded throughout his life by military intelligence personnel, did not involve himself in such matters. Or so we are to believe. Before succeeding in his musical career, however, John did seem to find himself, quite innocently of course, in some rather unusual places. One such place was Havana, Cuba, where Phillips arrived at the very height of the Cuban Revolution. For the record, Phillips has claimed that he went to Havana as nothing more than a concerned private citizen, with the intention of, "You're going to love this one," fighting for Castro. Because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks in those days traveled abroad to thwart CIA operations before taking up residence in Laurel Canyon and joining the hippie generation. During the 2 weeks or so that the Cuban Missile Crisis played out, a few years after Castro took power, Phillips found himself cooling his heels in Jacksonville, Florida, alongside the Mayport Naval Station. Anyway, let's move on to yet another of Laurel Canyon's earliest and brightest stars, Mr. Stephen Stills. Stills will have the distinction of being a founding member of two of Laurel Canyon's most acclaimed and beloved bands, Buffalo Springfield, and, needless to say, Crosby, Stills. David M. C. Gowan. 1-7. And Nash. In addition, Stills will pen perhaps the first, and certainly one of the most enduring anthems of the 60s generation, For What It's Worth, the opening lines of which appear at the top of this chapter. Stills' follow-up single will be entitled Bluebird, which, coincidentally or not, happens to be the original codename assigned to the CIA's MKUltra program. Before his arrival in Laurel Canyon, Stephen Stills was the product of yet another career military family. Raised partly in Texas, young Stephen spent large swaths of his childhood in El Salvador, Costa Rica, the Panama Canal Zone, and various other parts of Central America, alongside his father, who was, we can be fairly certain, helping to spread democracy to the unwashed masses in that endearingly American way. As with the rest of our cast of characters, Stills was educated primarily at schools on military bases and at elite military academies. Among his contemporaries in Laurel Canyon, he was widely viewed as having an abrasive, authoritarian personality. Nothing unusual about any of that, of course, as we have already seen. There is, however, an even more curious aspect to the Stephen Stills story. Stephen will later tell anyone who will sit and listen that he had served time for Uncle Sam in the jungles of Vietnam. These tales will be universally dismissed by chroniclers of the era as nothing more than drug-induced delusions. Such a thing couldn't possibly be true, it will be claimed, since Stills arrived on the Laurel Canyon scene at the very time that the first uniformed troops began shipping out, and he remained in the public eye thereafter. And it will of course be quite true that Stephen Stills could not have served with uniformed ground troops in Vietnam, but what will be ignored is the undeniable fact that the US had thousands of advisors, which is to say, CIA Special Forces operatives, active in the country for a good many years before the arrival of the first official ground troops. What will also be ignored is that, given his background, his age, and the timeline of events, Stephen Stills not only could indeed have seen action in Vietnam, he would seem to have been a prime candidate for such an assignment. After which, of course, he could rather quickly become, stop me if you've heard this one before, an icon of the peace generation. Another of those icons, and one of Laurel Canyon's most flamboyant residents, is a young man by the name of David Crosby, founding MEM. WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON. 1-8. Bear of the seminal Laurel Canyon band The Byrds, as well as, of course, Crosby, Stills and Nash. Crosby is, not surprisingly, the son of an Annapolis graduate and World War II military intelligence officer, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Like others in this story, Floyd Crosby spent much of his post-service time traveling the world. Those travels landed him in places like Haiti, where he paid a visit in 1927, when the country just happened to be, coincidentally of course, under military occupation by the US Marines. One of the Marines doing that occupying was a guy that we met earlier by the name of Captain Claude Andrew Phillips. But David Crosby is much more than just the son of Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, as it turns out, is a scion of the closely intertwined Van Cortlandt, Van Schuyler and Van Rensselaer families. And while you're probably thinking, the Van Who farmer lies, I can assure you that if you plug those names in over at Wikipedia, you can spend a pretty fair amount of time reading up on the power wielded by this clan for the last, 2¼ centuries or so. Suffice it to say that the Crosby family tree includes a truly dizzying array of U.S. senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress. It also includes, I should hasten to add, for those of you with a taste for such things, more than a few high-ranking Masons. Stephen Van Rensselaer III, for example, reportedly served as Grand Master of Masons for New York. And if all that isn't impressive enough, According to the New England Genealogical Society, David Van Cortlandt Crosby is also a direct descendant of founding FAthers and Federalist Papers authors Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. If there is, as many believe, a network of elite families that has shaped national and world events for a very long time, then it is ably safe to say that David Crosby is a bloodline member of that clan, which may explain, come to think of it, why his semen seems to be in such demand in certain circles, because, if we're being honest here, it certainly can't be due to his looks or talent. If America had royalty, then David Crosby would probably be a duke, or a prince, or something similar. But other than that, he is just a normal, run-of-the-mill kind of guy who just happened to shine as one of Laurel Canyon's brightest stars. And who, I guess I should add, has a real fondness for guns, esp. David M. C. Gowan. 19. Chiller handguns, which he has maintained a sizable collection of for his entire life. According to those closest to him, it is a rare occasion when Mr. Crosby is not packing heat. John Phillips also owned and sometimes carried handguns. And according to Crosby himself, he has, on at least one occasion, discharged a firearm in anger at another human being. All of which made him, of course, an obvious choice for the flower children to rally around. Another shining star on the Laurel Canyon scene, just a few years later, will be singer-songwriter Jackson Browne, who is, are you getting as bored with this as I am, the product of a career military family. Browne's father was assigned to post-war reconstruction work in GER, which very likely means that he was in the employ of the OSS, precursor to the CIA. As readers of my earlier work, Understanding the F-Word, may recall, U.S. involvement in post-war reconstruction in GER. Many largely consisted of maintaining as much of the Nazi infrastructure as possible while shielding war criminals from capture and prosecution. Against that backdrop, Jackson Browne was born in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. Some 2 decades later, he emerged as, oh, never mind. Let's talk instead about 3 other Laurel Canyon vocalists who will rise to dizzying heights of fame and fortune: Jerry Beckley, Dan Peek, and Dewey Bunnell. Individually, these 3 names are probably known to virtually all readers, but collectively, as the band America, the 3 will score huge hits in the early 70s with such songs as Ventura Highway, A Horse with No Name, and The Wizard of Oz themed The Tin Man. I guess I probably don't need to add here that all 3 of these lads were products of the military intelligence community. Beckley's dad was the commander of the now-defunct West Ruislip USAF base near London, England, a facility deeply immersed in intelligence operations. Bunnell's and Peek's fathers were both career Air Force officers serving under Beckley's dad at West Ruislip, which is where the 3 boys first met. We could also, I suppose, discuss Mike Nesmith of the Monkees and Corey Wells of Three Dog Night, 2 more hugely successful Laurel Canyon bands, who both arrived in LA not long after serving time with the U.S. Air Force. Nesmith also inherited a family fortune estimated at $25 million. Graham Parsons, who will briefly replace David Crosby in the WEIRDSCENSIDETHECANYON. 20. Birds before fronting the Flying Burrito Brothers, was the son of Major Cecil Ingram, Coon Dog Connor II, a decorated military officer and bomber pilot who reportedly flew over 50 combat missions. Parsons was also an heir, on his mother's side, to the formidable Snively fam Eiley Fortune. Said to be the wealthiest family in the exclusive enclave of Winter Haven, Florida, the Snively family was the proud owner of Snively Groves Incorporated, which reportedly owned as much as 1/3 of all the citrus groves in the state of Florida. And so it goes as one scrolls through the roster of Laurel Canyon superstars. What one finds, far more often than not, are the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex and the sons and daughters of extreme wealth and privilege, oftentimes, you'll find both rolled into one convenient package. Every once in a while, you will also stumble across a former child actor, like Brandon DeWilde or Monkey Mickey Dolenz, or eccentric prodigy Van Dyke Parks. You might also encounter some former mental patients, such as James Taylor, who spent time in 2 different mental institutions in Massachusetts before hitting the Laurel Canyon scene, or Larry Wildman Fisher, who was institutionalized repeatedly during his teen years, once for attacking his mother with a knife, an act that was gleefully mocked by Zappa on the cover of Fisher's first album. Finally, you might find the offspring of an organized crime figure, like Warren Zevon, the son of William Stumpy Zevon, a lieutenant for infamous LA crime lord Mickey Cohen. All these folks gathered nearly simultaneously along the narrow, winding roads of Laurel Canyon. They came from across the country, although the Washington, D.C. area was noticeably overrepresented, as well as from Canada and England, and in at least one case, all the way from Nazi Germany. They came even though, at the time, there was no music industry in Los Angeles. They came even though, at the time, there was no live music scene to speak of. They came even though, in retrospect, there was no discernible reason for them to do so. It would, of course, make sense these days for an aspiring musician to venture out to Los Angeles. But in those days, the centers of the music universe were Nashville, Memphis, and New York. It wasn't the industry that drew the Laurel Canyon crowd, you see, but rather the Laurel Canyon crowd that transformed Los Angeles into the epicenter of the music industry. To what then do we attribute this unprecedented? David M. C. Gowan. 2-1. Ed gathering of future musical superstars in the hills above Los Angeles. What was it that inspired them all to head out west? Perhaps Neil Young said it best when he told an interviewer that he couldn't really say why he headed out to LA circa 1966. He and others were just going like lemmings.